I got a job as a night shift security guard at a large parking lot on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it paid well enough, and I thought it would be easy. Just drive around in a golf cart, make sure no one was breaking into cars, and occasionally deal with a lost or drunk person. Pretty straightforward, right? The parking lot was massive, sprawling over several acres, and serving as the parking area for a nearby shopping mall that had seen better days. The mall itself was mostly empty now, with only a few stores still hanging on. That meant the parking lot was usually pretty empty at night, which suited me just fine. Less trouble to deal with. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. The first few nights were uneventful. I drove around, sipped my coffee, and listened to the radio. I'd park the golf cart in a spot with a good view of the lot, kick back, and watch YouTube videos on my phone. The hours dragged on, but it wasn't bad. It was quiet, and the money was easy. But things started to get weird around my fourth night on the job. It was a Tuesday night, and the lot was almost completely empty. There were a few cars scattered around, but nothing out of the ordinary. I was parked near the entrance, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed something moving in the distance. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make it out. It was a man walking between the rows of cars. This wasn't too unusual. Sometimes people would wander into the lot, looking for their car or trying to cut through to the other side. I started up the golf cart and headed over to see if he needed help or if he was up to no good. As I got closer, I could see he was an older man, probably in his 60s. He was wearing a long coat and a hat, and he was walking slowly, almost shuffling. I pulled up beside him and rolled down the window. "Hey there, you need any help?" I asked. He didn't respond. He just kept walking, staring straight ahead. I drove alongside him for a bit, repeating my question, but he acted like I wasn't even there. Finally, I parked the cart and got out, intending to get his attention more directly. "Sir, are you all right?" I said, stepping in front of him. He stopped and looked at me. His eyes were empty and distant. There was something off about him, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He didn't say anything, just stared at me for a moment before turning and walking away, heading deeper into the lot. I stood there for a minute, feeling uneasy. There was something about the way he looked at me that was unsettling, but he wasn't causing any trouble, so I let it go and got back in the cart, keeping an eye on him as he disappeared into the darkness. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The image of that old man's empty eyes haunted me. The next night I was more alert, keeping an eye out for anything unusual. For the first few hours, everything was quiet. Then around midnight, I saw him again. The same old man, walking slowly between the rows of cars. This time I didn't approach him. I just watched from a distance as he wandered around the lot. He followed the same pattern as before, walking up and down the rows, seemingly aimless. After about half an hour, he disappeared again. Over the next few nights, the sightings became more frequent. Every night around the same time he would appear, walking the same path, never acknowledging me or anyone else. It was starting to freak me out, but I didn't know what to do. He wasn't causing any harm, just wandering around, but there was something deeply unsettling about him. I decided to talk to my boss about it. Mr. Harris was an old-school kind of guy, gruff and no-nonsense. When I told him about the old man, he just shrugged. "Probably just some homeless guy," he said. "As long as he's not causing trouble, leave him be, but keep an eye on him." I wasn't satisfied with that, but there wasn't much else I could do. So, I kept doing my job, keeping an eye on the old man whenever he showed up. But then things started to get even weirder. One night I was parked near the back of the lot watching a movie on my phone when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I looked up, expecting to see the old man, but it wasn't him. It was a woman, younger, maybe in her 30s, walking quickly between the rows of cars. She looked scared, glancing over her shoulder as she walked. I started up the cart and drove over to her. As I got closer, she saw me and ran over, waving her arms. "Help! Please help me!" she cried. I stopped the cart and jumped out. "What's wrong?" "There's someone following me," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't know who he is, but he's been following me for hours." I looked around, but I didn't see anyone. "Where did you see him last?" "Over there." She pointed toward the far end of the lot, near the entrance to the mall. I told her to get in the cart, and we drove over to where she had seen the man. I kept an eye out, but there was no one there. The lot was empty, eerily silent. "I don't see anyone," I said, feeling a bit foolish. "Are you sure he was following you?" "Yes, I'm sure," she insisted. "He was right behind me. He looked strange." We drove around the lot for a while, but we didn't see anyone. Finally, I offered to call the police, but she declined. "No, it's all right," she said. "I think I lost him. Thank you for your help." She got out of the cart and hurried away, glancing over her shoulder as she went. I watched her go, feeling uneasy. First the old man, now this. Something was definitely off. The next night I saw her again. She was wandering the lot, looking just as scared as before. This time I didn't approach her. I just watched as she walked between the rows of cars, glancing over her shoulder. Eventually, she disappeared into the darkness, just like the old man. I decided to do some digging. I went online and searched for any information about the parking lot and the mall. What I found sent chills down my spine. Years ago, there had been a series of disappearances in the area. People would go to the mall and never come back. There were rumors of kidnappings, but nothing was ever proven. The mall's decline started around the same time, and it had never recovered. I found an old news article with a photo of one of the missing people. It was the woman I had seen in the parking lot. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she had disappeared 10 years ago. I sat back, feeling sick. The old man, the woman, they were both missing persons. And they were appearing in the parking lot, night after night. I didn't know what to do. I considered quitting, but I needed the job. Instead, I decided to try and document what I was seeing. I brought a camera to work and started recording my shifts, hoping to capture something that could explain what was happening. The next few nights were quiet. I didn't see the old man or the woman. I started to think maybe it was over, that whatever was happening had stopped. But then one night things took a turn for the worse. It was around 2 a.m. and I was parked near the middle of the lot, watching the monitors in the office. I saw movement on one of the screens and switched to the camera feed. It was the old man, walking between the rows of cars. But this time, he wasn't alone. There was a figure behind him, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall, with long limbs and an unnatural gait. It followed the old man, matching his slow, shuffling pace. I grabbed my flashlight and ran out to the golf cart. I drove as fast as I could to where I had seen them on the monitor. When I got there, the old man was gone, but the figure was still there, standing in the middle of the row of cars, staring at me. I shone my flashlight on it, but the light seemed to have no effect. The figure was just a shadow, dark and formless. It started to move toward me, gliding across the pavement without making a sound. I backed up, my heart pounding. I wanted to run, but I couldn't look away. The figure kept coming, getting closer and closer. I could feel a cold, suffocating presence, like all the air was being sucked out of the lot. Finally, I broke free of my paralysis and turned to run. I didn't stop until I was back in the office, slamming the door behind me. I locked it and sat down, trying to catch my breath. The monitors were blank, showing nothing but static. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't quit, not without another job lined up. But I couldn't keep doing this. The lot was haunted, and whatever was there was getting more aggressive. The next night I came to work with a plan. I brought a friend with me, someone who believed in the paranormal and had experience dealing with spirits. His name was Mark, and he had all sorts of equipment, EMF meters, cameras, and even a Ouija board. We set up in the office, watching the monitors and waiting for something to happen. For the first few hours, it was quiet. Then, around midnight, the old man appeared on the screen. "There he is," I said, pointing to the monitor. "That's him." Mark watched, his face serious. All right, let's see what we're dealing with. We grabbed our equipment and headed out. The old man was walking his usual path, and we followed at a distance, trying not to spook him. Mark had his EMF meter out, and it was going crazy. There's definitely something here, he said. The energy is off the charts. We followed the old man to the far end of the lot, near the entrance to the mall. Suddenly, he stopped and turned to look at us. His eyes were empty with no facial expressions, just like before. What do you want? Mark called out, holding up the EMF meter. The old man didn't respond. He just stared at us, and then he started to change. His form flickered, becoming translucent. The shadowy figure appeared behind him, growing darker and more defined. Get back to the office, Mark shouted. We ran, the shadowy figure close behind. We barely made it to the office, slamming the door shut just in time. The monitors were still showing static, and the air inside was cold and thick. We need to leave, Mark said, grabbing his gear. This place is dangerous. There's something here that doesn't want us around. I could tell he was freaking out, so I didn't argue. We packed up and left, driving away from the parking lot as fast as we could. As we drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I saw the old man standing at the entrance to the lot, watching us leave. Then he was gone. I quit the next day. I couldn't go back there, not after what I had seen. I don't know what's haunting that parking lot, but it's something dark and malevolent. I've tried to forget about it, to move on, but the memory still haunts me. People think Mark and I are crazy, but I know what we saw. I still have nightmares about it. I've always been drawn to places that people usually avoid, so when the opportunity came to work as a night security guard at the old Crestwood Cemetery, I took it without hesitation. It was an odd job for sure, but the pay was decent, and I liked the solitude. Little did I know I was stepping into something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. My first day on the job was a blur of paperwork and quick tours of the grounds. The cemetery was large, sprawling across several acres, filled with ancient tombstones, statues of angels and saints, and large, looming trees that cast eerie shadows in the moonlight. The previous security guard had left abruptly, but no one seemed to know why. The manager, Mr. Talbot, dismissed it as a personal issue, but the unease in his eyes told me there was more to the story. By the time my first night shift rolled around, I was ready. I had a flashlight, a sturdy baton, and a radio to communicate with the main office. The office was a small, cramped building near the entrance of the cemetery. It was filled with old monitors displaying various parts of the grounds, all in grainy black and white. The silence was thick and suffocating. As the clock struck midnight, I began my first patrol. The air was crisp and cool, and the moon cast an ethereal glow over the headstones. It was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. I walked slowly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating the names of the deceased. I found the solitude calming, almost peaceful. Around 1 a.m., I reached the oldest part of the cemetery, where the headstones were crumbling and covered in moss. There was a large mausoleum at the center, its stone walls cracked and weathered with age. As I approached, I felt a sudden chill in the air, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. I shivered and pulled my jacket tighter around me. Suddenly, my radio crackled to life. It was Mr. Talbot. "Everything all right out there?" he asked, his voice distorted by static. "Yeah, just fine," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just a bit chilly." "Good to hear. Keep an eye out around the old mausoleum. We've had reports of vandalism there." I assured him I would and clipped the radio back onto my belt. I took a deep breath and approached the mausoleum. As I walked closer, I noticed something strange. The heavy iron gate that guarded the entrance was slightly ajar. I knew for a fact it had been closed and locked earlier in the day. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the stone walls. "Anyone here?" There was no answer. I pushed the gate open with a loud creak and stepped inside. The air was musty and cold, and my flashlight flickered as if the batteries were dying. I cursed under my breath and banged it against my palm until the light steadied. The inside of the mausoleum was small and cramped, with only a few stone sarcophagi and a narrow staircase leading down into the crypt. I felt a knot of unease in my stomach as I stared at the stairs. Something about them seemed to call to me, urging me to descend into the darkness. I shook off the feeling and turned to leave when I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The whispering grew louder, echoing around the small chamber. It was unintelligible, but it sounded like multiple voices all speaking at once, overlapping and intertwining in a haunting melody. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I backed out of the mausoleum, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The whispering continued, growing more insistent. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back at the main office. I slammed the door behind me and collapsed into the chair, trying to catch my breath. For the rest of the night, I kept an eye on the monitors, watching the mausoleum from a safe distance. The whispering never stopped, and I could see shadows moving inside, even though no one should have been there. When dawn finally broke, I left the office, eager to put as much distance between myself and that mausoleum as possible. The next night, I was hesitant to return, but I needed the job. I armed myself with extra batteries for my flashlight and a thermos of hot coffee to keep me alert. As the clock struck midnight, I began my patrol again, my nerves on edge. When I reached the old part of the cemetery, the air grew cold once more. The mausoleum stood silent and foreboding in the moonlight. The gate was closed, but I could see it rattling slightly as if something inside was trying to get out. I forced myself to approach, my heart pounding in my chest. This time I didn't call out. I simply stood there, staring at the gate, listening. The whispering started again, louder and more aggressive than before. It felt like it was coming from all around me, seeping into my mind. I could make out fragments of words, but they were twisted and distorted like a nightmare brought to life. Leave, not welcome, death. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering wildly. The shadows inside the mausoleum seemed to pulse and writhe, taking on vaguely human shapes. I turned and ran again, my footsteps echoing through the silent cemetery. I didn't stop until I was back in the office, locking the door behind me. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and paranoia. I watched the monitors, expecting to see those shadowy figures appear at any moment, but they never did. When dawn broke, I was exhausted and shaken, but determined to get to the bottom of what was happening. I reached out to the local historical society, hoping to find someone who could shed some light on the mausoleum's history. This was before the internet became a widespread thing. I spoke with an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had lived in the town all her life. The Blackwoods were a cursed family, she told me, her voice trembling. They dabbled in dark things better left alone. It's said that their spirits can't find peace, and that they're trapped in that mausoleum. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What can I do?" I asked. "How do I stop them?" Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "Some things can't be stopped, young man. You're better off leaving that place. Let the dead rest." Her words haunted me as I returned to the cemetery for another night. I felt a growing sense of dread as midnight approached. This time, I decided to avoid the mausoleum altogether. I focused on patrolling the newer sections of the cemetery, trying to keep my mind off the whispering voices. But it wasn't long before I felt that familiar chill in the air. The whispering started again, even though I was nowhere near the mausoleum. It was fainter, but it was there, like a distant chorus of lost souls. I tried to ignore it, but it grew louder, more insistent. I felt a presence behind me and spun around, but there was nothing there. The whispering continued, wrapping around me like a shroud. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with the spare batteries, my hands shaking, but I could feel something closing in on me. In a panic, I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away. The whispering followed me, growing louder and more chaotic. I stumbled over a gravestone and fell, scraping my hands on the rough ground. As I lay there, I saw shadowy figures moving among the headstones, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I scrambled to my feet and ran again, not stopping until I reached the office. I slammed the door shut and collapsed into the chair, my heart racing. The whispering had stopped, but I could still feel their presence, lurking just outside. For the rest of the night, I sat there, too terrified to move. When dawn finally came, I made up my mind. I couldn't do this anymore. The cemetery was haunted, and whatever was there wasn't going to let me be. I went to Mr. Talbot and handed in my resignation. He didn't seem surprised, just nodded and thanked me for my service. As I left the cemetery for the last time, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But I knew I would never forget the nights I spent there, the whispering voices, and the shadowy figures. The Crestwood Cemetery had a dark and malevolent presence, and I was glad to leave it behind. Whatever haunted that place, it was something beyond my understanding, something I hoped never to encounter again. Working as a janitor at the old Hawthorne office complex, a relic of the 1970s, had always felt like stepping into a different era. The building, with its flickering lights, creaky floors, and outdated security system, was a place most people avoided after sunset. But for me, working the night shift was a necessity. It was steady pay, and I needed it. The job was simple enough: clean the offices, empty the trash, mop the floors, and make sure everything was in order for the daytime employees. It was mundane, but it had its eerie moments. The silence of the empty hallways was often broken by strange noises: the hum of the old HVAC system, the occasional groan of the building settling, and sometimes inexplicable sounds that made my skin crawl. One night, everything changed. It was a particularly quiet evening, and I was the only one in the building, or so I thought. I had just finished mopping the lobby floor and was heading up to the 3rd floor to empty the trash bins. The elevator, an old clunky contraption, groaned and shuddered as it carried me up. I always felt uneasy in that elevator, but taking the stairs seemed even worse. When the doors finally creaked open, I stepped out into the dimly lit hallway. The 3rd floor housed the offices of a small law firm that had been there for decades. The place always had a musty smell, like old books and damp carpet. As I pushed my cart down the hallway, I noticed something odd. The door to one of the offices was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered locking all the doors earlier. Unease settled in my stomach as I approached the door. I pushed it open slowly and peered inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the floor. I stepped inside, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Everything seemed in order, but there was a strange, cold draft. Suddenly, I heard a soft whisper. It was so faint that I thought I had imagined it. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. My heart started to race. I was used to the odd sounds of the building, but this was different. It felt personal. I decided to finish up quickly and get out of there. As I emptied the trash bins and wiped down the desks, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but the room was empty. The whispering continued, just on the edge of hearing, like a conversation happening in another room. I hurried out of the office, pulling the door shut behind me. The hallway felt even darker now, the shadows deeper. I pushed my cart towards the elevator, my steps echoing loudly in the silence. As I reached the end of the hallway, I heard it again. The whisper, louder this time. It was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. At the far end of the hallway, I saw a figure. It was just standing there, barely visible in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out any details, but it was definitely a person, or something that looked like a person. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I took a hesitant step back, and the figure moved forward, gliding silently towards me. I bolted for the elevator, slamming the button frantically. The doors creaked open and I jumped inside, hitting the ground floor button repeatedly. As the doors slowly closed, I saw the figure approaching, its face still hidden in shadow. Just before the doors shut completely, I saw its eyes. dark, empty voids that seemed to pierce right through me. The elevator descended painfully slowly, and I could feel the presence of the figure pressing in on me, even though I was alone. When the doors finally opened on the ground floor, I ran out, not stopping until I was outside in the cool night air. I doubled over, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. I couldn't go back inside. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. I got into my car and drove home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't sleep that night, haunted by the memory of those eyes. The next day I called in sick. I spent the day researching the history of the Hawthorne office complex. What I found made my blood run cold. Decades ago, a woman had died on the 3rd floor under mysterious circumstances. Her name was Margaret Hawthorne, the daughter of the building's original owner. Some said she had been pushed, others claimed she had jumped. But everyone agreed on one thing: her spirit never left the building. The next day I quit my job, never to return to that haunted building.